Hello, and welcome to the Reconstruction.U.S podcast, the place where people from all walks of life discuss what we can all do to transform America into a more resilient, equitable nation, and ourselves in the process. My name is Kimberly Miller, and I am the host of this program, as well as the website re-construction.us, where you'll find more interviews like this one, along with articles and essays about making real change. Our country saw a rise in hate crimes during the last administration when Donald Trump consistently denigrated communities of color in favor of white nationalism. But for all of that rhetoric, the experience of living in a large urban center with people from all walks of life is one of the most precious aspects of American life for many of us. Los Angeles, California, is one of the largest and most diverse cities and counties in the United States. With over 10 million residents, it has one of the largest cultural tapestries of any place in the world as well. There is a great amount of unity within different communities and harmony among folks who, for all their diversity, all see themselves as Angelenos. There can be adversity as well, of course, but it can be addressed and reduced effectively. Decades ago, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors established the Human Relations Commission to help address issues of concern, most notably hate crimes. They were on the rise in the late 1990s, but have dropped off dramatically since. Today's interview is with a leader in the commission who has worked on this issue for years. I've asked him to join me today to share his experience in working on hate crimes and what strategies they have found most effective in fostering unity in a highly diverse area of our country. Marshall Wong is a native of Los Angeles and has served as a senior human relations consultant with the Commission since 1999. He is the Commission's hate crime coordinator and the principal of the agency's annual hate crime report. Marshall also staffs a county-wide coalition, the Network Against Hate Crime, and provides training for law enforcement and service providers. Welcome to our podcast, Marshall. Really appreciate you making the time and sharing your insights with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, perhaps you could start off for those who have not had the opportunity to live in Los Angeles. Tell us a little bit about the Human Relations Commission. How did it start and how has it evolved?
The Human Relations Commission was created back in the 1940s, actually in response to a series of hate crimes. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the Zoot Suit riots that occurred. During World War II, there were a number of fights instigated by off-duty military personnel in LA County, who would in particular target for harassment pachucos, or the Zoot Suiters. These were young men, primarily Mexican-American, and they had a particular style of dress that was quite recognizable: high-waisted pants, long jackets, wide-brimmed hats, chains, and the Zoot Suiters, or pachucos, well, they basically were like youthful, rebellious fashionistas, in the same way as today, people who wear hip-hop clothing are singled out, and many people see them and think immediately thug, gangbanger. So it was a similar kind of experience that the pachucos faced back in the 40s. And there were these random attacks by off-duty servicemen, which ultimately erupted in several days of rioting and a very famous murder trial. All of this is captured in the play, musical, and film Zoot Suit, by Luis Valdez. The County Board of Supervisors responded by creating this agency to be their eyes and ears at the community level, so that when there were tensions like this between different groups of people, they could be spotted, recognized, and attention could be directed before a disruption escalated into widespread civil unrest. So the commission has been known for a number of things over the years, of one of which has been studying the phenomena of hate crime. And we have been collecting and analyzing data on hate crime since 1980, making our annual report one of the longest standing efforts on the part of any governmental agency nationwide to look into our backyard and see, what does this phenomenon look like? Who is doing what to who, where, and for what reason?
Marshall, could you tell us, how does the commission, or how do you define a hate crime as opposed to some other kind of attack or violence?
So, according to the California state statute, hate crime charges can be brought against a defendant if bias, um, hatred, prejudice is a significant motivating factor in the commission of an offense. There has to be an underlying crime. Hate crime laws don't try to limit what people can think or even what they can say, but there has to be an underlying crime, and the victim has to be either a member of or perceived to be what we call a protected class. In California, our hate crime laws are among the most inclusive and comprehensive in the nation. So protection is provided for people based on their race, ethnicity, nationality, national origin, uh, based on religion, sexual orientation, disability, gender, or gender identity. Okay? In many states, hate crime laws only provide protection based on race and religion. And there are some states that have no hate crime laws on the books at all. Okay. So if someone is found guilty of an underlying offense, vandalism, simple assault, aggravated assault, making a criminal threat, and there's evidence that it was motivated by hate, which could be bigoted language, it could be the white supremacist literature someone has in their car or in their home. It could be even what website someone visits, that could lay the groundwork to prove that bias was a significant motivating factor. Okay? If someone is found guilty of not only the underlying offense, but also what we call a hate crime enhancement, there can be more serious penalties, usually a few more years of jail time. However, in California, if someone's found guilty of a hate motivated homicide, it's automatically life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Okay. Now, this is not without its critics. Some people say, why should two people who are guilty of the same crime be given different sentences? Okay? Does it really matter why the crime was committed? And reasonable people can wind up on both sides of this argument. But increasingly, we as a society are saying there is a difference. Yeah. So if, say, a man kills his wife in a fit of jealous rage, that's a terrible, terrible crime, but it's one victim. Okay. Conversely, if, say, a street gang kills, uh, randomly kills an African American victim as a message to all African Americans in the neighborhood that they could be next, then you have an entire community that's been attacked. And so, apart from the victim of the homicide, you have other people who live in daily fear, and the quality of their lives is diminished. And
Hmm.
for that reason, it's treated as a more serious crime and deserving of more serious punishment.
I can remember the first time I heard about a man being murdered by a gang and was gay bashing. And it was a truly horrifying event, and it deeply affected everybody that knew and loved him. And it did what it was designed to do. It put fear in the community. It's a kind of domestic terrorism in terms of trying to really intimidate and hold back people from certain groups. Would that be a good way to describe it?
Yes, let me give you another example.
Okay.
Recently, here in LA County, we had gang members who were convicted of a series of arson attacks at a housing project in East LA,
Okay.
uh, at the Ramona Gardens housing uh, development. These were members of the Big Hazard gang, which is affiliated with the Mexican mafia, one of the largest and most violent of the prison-based gangs. The Mexican mafia has been warring with Black inmates for decades, and they've given a green light to all of their street affiliates to try to drive African Americans out of their turf. Okay? In this case, what the members of the gang did is they threw Molotov cocktails through the windows of Black families in the housing development. And
Mm.
fortunately, none of them exploded, but they landed in the rooms where children were sleeping. Okay?
Right, right.
As a result of it, not just the families that were attacked requested to move out, all of the Black families in the entire housing development requested to be transferred. Okay. And so that's an example of how hate crime can affect an entire um, community.
How have you gone about responding and working to try to reduce these kinds of hate crimes?
We collect data from every law enforcement agency in LA County, and there are more than 40. Also from colleges and universities and some school districts, and a small group of community-based organizations that have trained staff who can take reports directly from victims who may not feel comfortable going to police directly. Okay? And then what we do is we collect all of that information, we make sure there are no duplicates, and we feed it into our database. We make sure that every single case complies with the letter of the law so that they can be classified as hate crimes. And then what we do is ask a series of questions through queries. And the the results have been disturbing, but also consistent over time. So, for example, African Americans constitute only about 9% of LA County residents, but are half of victims of racial hate crime. Sometimes four, sometimes five, sometimes six times their presence in the general population. Okay, so as I mentioned before, racialized gang violence is one of the factors which has made the overrepresentation of African Americans as victims of racial hate crime a serious problem year after year.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, we also see that Latinos are consistently the second largest group. And disturbingly, in most years, the majority of anti-Black hate crimes are committed by Latinos and vice versa. Okay. So that's been one very, very disturbing trend that we've been documenting for some time.
And is that because of the Mexican gang activity you were referring to, or do you see other
We used,
things
we used to see
influencing it?
more African American gangs involved in anti-Latino hate crimes, but that has dropped considerably over the years. Okay.
Okay.
The other thing is that when we look at what makes a neighborhood or a city or a region prone to larger numbers of hate crimes, one of the things that we found is, we take these maps and we overlay them with other demographic information. And the most significant thing is if a neighborhood has undergone a dramatic transformation in its racial composition, if and only if you also have high rates of poverty and unemployment. Okay, so a classic example of this would be South LA. When I was in high school, the schools in South LA were 70, 80, 90% African American, sometimes more.
Right.
And then along came in the 1980s civil wars in Central America that drove all of these refugees out of the country, and many wound up in Southern California looking for affordable housing. There were also waves of Mexican immigrants as well, who were coming, escaping poverty, looking for a better life, and many found affordable housing in South LA. So here you had two groups of people with little to no prior contact with each other, okay, in the same neighborhoods, in the same schools, um, uh, where there was the constant perception of competition for scarce resources,
Mm,
whether that be jobs or political power or funding. And that's the perfect storm. Okay.
mm,
So today, those schools are 60, 70, 80% Latino. And it happened in a very, very quick period of time. Now, there wasn't tension among everyone, but even something like uh, one of the things you would hear from like longtime Black residents in South LA complaining, hey, my son can't even get a job at McDonald's because they require that the employees speak Spanish now. How fair is that? So that would be one like tiny example of some of the daily pressures and tensions and stresses that could lead to intergroup conflict. Another finding that we found, another finding in the report that's been very consistent is that anti-LGBT crimes are usually the second largest group following racial. They comprise, anywhere between uh, 20, 25%. They overwhelmingly target gay men as opposed to lesbians, and that they are much more likely to be of a violent nature than either racial or religious crimes. Okay. What do we know about religious crimes? That they are overwhelmingly targeting the Jewish community, um, and that they are mostly crimes against property, not against people. So the violence rate is much lower. They tend to be things like swastikas or other hate symbols or graffiti on homes, businesses, vehicles owned by Jews. Okay. So the the other group that we see with extremely high rates of violence, consistently the highest, would be anti-transgender crimes. Um, and in 3 out of the last 4 years, we've had record numbers of anti-transgender crimes reported. But we don't know if that's because of rising anti-transgender sentiment or if it's because of transgender empowerment. We're in a situation today where there's probably never been so much attention paid to trans issues,
that's
the
very
visibility,
true. Yeah.
visibility of trans people in pop culture, the number of school districts that have adopted policies to protect trans students. And so we wonder if what's going on is actually trans victims of hate crime who in the past would have been reluctant to come forward, mistrustful of police, worried that they would not be treated respectfully or that they might be humiliated. okay, are now coming forward and saying, I expect to be treated with respect. I demand to be treated with respect, and are much more emboldened to demand justice.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's I can see where, um, as the culture evolves, you could really it might take some work to kind of suss out what are the dynamics really at play here as things change. I think these days more than ever, people expect to see more and more, but with all the white supremacy and nationalist movements that have come to the fore under the Trump administration. But you meaning Los Angeles County, seem to really be bucking that trend. And that seems to me to be some good news to talk about.
So, hate crimes in LA County peaked in 2001 because of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. That was the only year where we ever saw more than 1,000 hate crimes reported in LA County. There were 188 anti-Muslim and anti-Middle Eastern crimes that were reported, mostly during the 3 weeks following September 11th. Okay. Um, since that time, we have seen hate crimes overall decline and fell by more than a half. We've also seen during the late 90s and early 2000s, that was probably the peak of a lot of the racialized gang violence as well. That's a much better picture than what we've seen um, 20 years ago. Now, uh, why is this? If you ask people why crime rates in general have fallen, you get all kinds of answers, and no one can really say for sure what's going on. Okay. Um, in some cases, uh, like although hate crimes between African Americans and Latinos still remain a significant problem, uh, perhaps as the years have gone by, there's a lot more familiarity between the two communities who live side by side in a place like South LA. Um, you know, uh, maybe, the next generation that grew up as English speaking peers in school, found a lot more similarities and commonalities, um, culturally, socially. Um, you know, uh, During this period of time, we've probably seen a lot more awareness about not just trans, but LGBT issues and communities in general. And I think that probably you would find major change, cultural shifts like same-sex marriage, becoming the law of the land, which I think cumulatively have a positive effect. More participation and representation of diverse communities in entertainment and the mass media, I think also cumulatively has a positive effect. I think one of the things that we still need to do a much better job on is making sure that that's not just in pop culture, but in school curricula. And, you know, University of California, it took them years and years before passing a requirement that all the students take at least one ethnic studies course. And it was very slow to roll out. Now the Cal State system has just passed a similar kind of requirement. They're arguing about what should be offered K through 12. And in the state government, there's been finally a model curriculum that's been developed after much debate, but those are just guidelines for individual school districts to utilize or not, And as someone who on the side is an adjunct professor of ethnic studies, my students tell me semester after semester that their education about the diverse peoples that make up LA County, the state, the nation is minimal. Okay. And particularly dealing with thorny issues like intergroup conflict, okay, or learning about what were in the roots of the LA, what were the roots of the LA riots. Almost nothing. So our schools, our public schools, are still not doing a good job of producing graduates who are culturally literate and well versed in issues of diversity and intolerance.
So it sounds like there are a few things that you have seen that have had a really positive influence. Culture, media, so to speak, entertainment being a big part, some law changes, and just more general social integration, let's say, either because communities have evolved over the decades and have learned to live together, or in the case of LGBTQ, maybe just more visibility and acceptance as gay marriage and other kinds of laws have changed. The Network Against Hate Crime, that's also one of your projects? Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
How does that work, and what role does that, do you work to play in terms of continuing to reduce hate crime with the network?
So the Network Against Hate Crime was established in 1984, and it's a countywide coalition that brings together um, representatives of law enforcement, including prosecutors, um, educators, people who work in civil and human rights organizations, um, people from probation, uh, clergy, and we hold quarterly meetings largely for professional development so that people who are engaged in this work can keep track of new developments in the field. So recently, last year, we had a network meeting devoted to the number of anti-Asian hate crimes that were being reported because of blaming Asians for coronavirus. Okay. We've had, guest speakers who have talked about some of these new white nationalist organizations that we only started hearing about a few years ago, like the Proud Boys or the um, uh, Rise Ahead movement, which are different than some of the uh, white supremacist groups of the past. So
Mhm.
they're trying to give a more professional image. And a number of the people who join these groups are, in fact, lawyers, doctors, engineers, but who are Western chauvinists. And they do in how they present themselves, they don't talk about hating anyone. They talk about being able to reclaim European pride. Now, in practice, a number of them have been arrested here in LA County because they traveled to uh, places where there was conflict, like, for example, Charlottesville, where they went there specifically to instigate fights with counter protesters and beat them up. Some of them traveled up to Berkeley when there was a controversial right-wing guest speaker on campus. And again, it attracted counter protesters, and they were there specifically to teach them a lesson physically. So, some of them are facing charges, not for crimes committed in LA County, but, in other jurisdictions, even though they're based here.
I know the rallies last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and in response to the murder of George Floyd were pretty huge in Los Angeles. Did you see much violence or counter protest at that time?
No. Um, as a matter of fact, I mean, I do think that there was one weekend when uh, there was both peaceful protests and riots at the same time, which then invited, a lot of arrests, and the National Guard was deployed. But for the most part, through those months, the rioting, although serious, was just a small part of what was going on, and there was widespread public displays of support for the protesters, even though not everyone felt comfortable because of the pandemic in participating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We also saw, and we saw both overreaction by law enforcement as well as other officers who would take a knee or show their support for the protests as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is not to say that there hasn't been some uh, pushback. And I think that, our former president was really trying to capitalize off of people's fears about the protests. This whole notion that they're going to be coming to your neighborhoods and the suburbs, and then they're and committing all these acts of violence was, I think, one of the things that allowed him to get as many votes as he did. But we did not see in LA County people who were counter protesting in any large numbers against, the BLM crowds.
That was actually one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you about this issue, because I think it's so important for us to present more accurate information about what's happening in the very cities that former President Trump went out of his way to denigrate. And to me, I look at the stats and what really has been going on in Los Angeles, and I see, a real, not only just improvement, but a real example of how you can have an area with such an enormous population and very diverse and have a tremendous amount of unity.
Well, I mean, I do think that California as a whole, and Los Angeles in particular, is uh, some people would say exceptional, other people would say ahead of its time. I mean, in LA County, I don't know what the most recent election exit polling showed, but in uh, 2016, only 1 in 5 voters in LA County supported Trump. In the San Francisco Bay Area, it was 1 in 10. So
Mhm.
you have a very, very different makeup here than even, say, in other parts of the state, the Inland Empire, the Central Valley. So I do think that we have more advanced policies and practices, although we still have a long ways to go.
Mhm.
And I do think that under the last 4 years, under this administration, we saw a lot of white nationalists feel more emboldened to um, gather in public places like Charlottesville, um, as well as for individuals to go out and commit some of the most horrific, um, you know, mass shootings at synagogues and black churches, and that we've seen ever. And so I think that there's reasons why people are anxious, particularly with the president giving so much moral support and encouragement to groups like the Proud Boys, But I don't think that has corresponded with widespread, um, you know, exponential jumps in hate crime.
That's very encouraging. at least for the moment. So, I know we have just a few minutes left here, Marshall, and I wonder if you could share with us what you would really see as the most effective way moving forward, especially in light of the fact that certainly Trump and so many of his nationalist followers have expressed a desire to continue to try to grow their movements. How can activists such as me or folks in other areas of the country um, leverage some of your learning to combat some of these efforts?
Well, I think, part of the polarization, including racial polarization in this country, is due to social media. And so I think that, the banning of Trump from Twitter and Facebook and things like that are a step in the right direction. I think that a number of these corporations need to be much, much more accountable about, violent and racist and bigoted kinds of messaging and crack down on it. Okay. I think also this whole notion of algorithms being, targeting social media users and kind of sending them headlines that will even reinforce, their pre-existing conspiratorial theories is a problem. Okay. And so I think that, public scrutiny, what our elected officials do, with regard to these, billionaire social media corporations is one important step. It's hard to see how people can do that as individuals, but in terms of a society-wide movement. Okay? I think in terms of hate crime prevention, the more that we can prepare young people to be culturally literate, to be appreciative of the contributions of diverse communities, but also, make them critical thinkers about things like, why is it that we see, over incarceration of African American and Latino youth? Is that because of cultural defect, or is that because of the results of mass incarceration due to drug policy? I mean, these are the kinds of issues that need to be discussed for people to have a much better understanding of why we see such inequities and uh, such income inequality. Okay, so I think education is a big part. Um, we need a lot better training for law enforcement when it comes to being able to detect and to investigate hate crimes. I mean, the large in LA County, the larger um, departments have the resources to be able to do basic minimal training. But for like the small departments, and that's the great majority, I mean, I've gone to do trainings with small police departments where all of a sudden there's an emergency call and half of the people in the class have to get up and respond to it because they have no coverage. you know I mean,
Yes, yes.
they don't they're short on resources, so we need to invest in that.
Mhm.
Once a hate crime has occurred, there has to be a culture where there's immediate denunciation, not just by elected leaders, but by clergy, by civic leaders, civil rights organizations across the board, so that people see that it's not just the community that was attacked that is standing up to resist. Okay. Um, when we've had serious hate crimes occur here, we've organized candlelight vigils, we've organized press conferences, educational programs, public fora. All of these help reduce the anxiety, um, allow for healing, and for people from diverse backgrounds to come together to get to know each other in a common mission to try to stop all bigotry and hate. So I think that these are some of the basic things that have to occur in order to be successful.
Excellent. Marshall, I just want to say thank you. I know that you have really dedicated your life to equity and to making really positive change, not only in Los Angeles County, but in this country. And so I just want to say it's been a real honor to get to spend this time with you. And I really, really appreciate the kind of focus that you're putting on education, as well as really just that in the moment unity that every community can participate in, so that it really becomes that issue of, together we stand, and we're not going to just be divided one community at a time. So thank you so much. If folks would like to learn more about the Human Relations Commission and about your ongoing work, where can they get more information?
If people are interested in learning more about the commission and downloading a copy of our annual hate crime report or looking at some of our other publications, they can visit HRC, that stands for Human Relations Commission, .lacounty.gov, G-O-V.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Marshall Wong, thanks again for all of your hard work there in Los Angeles and for spending the time with us today. Really appreciate you sharing your insights.
It's a pleasure.
This brings us to the end of another episode of re-construction.us. We hope you've enjoyed it and found it informative. Please do join us again next week when we'll have another interesting guest. And before you go, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this podcast. We have both an audio version on our website as well as this YouTube channel. And your passing it on will help us grow. Thank you and have a wonderful day.